Hello everybody, thank you so much for being here with me today and welcome to Wicked and Wild. If you're new here, Wicked and Wild is a segment on my channel where I do some true crime deep dives. And today we are discussing Shannan Gilbert, the missing girl whose search ultimately led to the discovery of the Long Island serial killer, aka Lisk. Now I will be doing a full video about Lisk. So if all goes as planned, that will be my next video that I release. But initially, when news broke about the arrest of Rex Heuermann, the alleged Long Island serial killer, I started doing research about it because, to my surprise, even though I consider myself to be pretty deep in the true crime community, I had never heard about this case. Then come to find out, there was a lot of mystery and remaining questions about the victims found on or near Gilgo Beach, and where the discovery all started with the search for Shannan Gilbert. But as one does, I went down one rabbit hole after another, and when I dug into Shannan's story, it just seemed necessary to start off this series with where it all began, to dive into the mystery of her disappearance and her untimely death. As of now, officials don't believe that Shannan Gilbert's death was connected to Lisk. However, that's still very widely debated. And even if she isn't a victim of Lisk, there's still a lot of mystery surrounding her death. And as we move forward, you'll see how these two cases are still very much intertwined. Also, since this story has been developing for the past 13 years, there's a lot of conflicting details. Things that were unknown 12 years ago, and then things that, came out more recently. So those details might differ a little bit. So I consumed as much information as I possibly could have. I really wanted to be sure that I got the story straight and that I stick to the facts as best I can. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and dive right in. Shannan Maria Gilbert was born on October 24th, 1986 in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, to her mother, Mary Gilbert, and her father, who seems to be a little bit of a ghost online. I wasn't able to find any information about him, not his name, his occupation, nothing. But nevertheless, Shannan was the oldest of four, along with her sisters, Stevie, Sherry, and Sarah. When Shannan was just 5 years old, Mary left the girl's father because allegedly he struggled with a heroin addiction and he was unable to take care of the family. So their childhood was turbulent, to say the least. If anybody knows what it's like growing up with a drug-addicted or alcoholic parent, I don't even need to say anything else. You know how it goes, and trust me, it's rough. After leaving Shannan's father, they relocated to Ellenville, New York. And while they left their father behind, their problems seemed to follow them. Unfortunately, their family was still very much broken, and the girls still suffered from abuse. Knowing what happens later, I really don't want to drag Mary's name through the mud, but at this time, Shannan's mom didn't feel like she was equipped to take care of Shannan, to where she placed Shannan in foster care, apparently because she was difficult to deal with as she suffered from mood swings and eating disorders, something that unfortunately a lot of young girls suffer from. Now listen, I'm not going to sit here and say that it's easy to raise children, because it's not. It can be very hard, especially when you're doing it on your own. But I don't see any reason why I would ever leave my child in foster care. In the true crime community, you hear a lot of the horror stories that come from the foster care system. And of course, that's not everyone's experience, but there's just not a chance in hell I would ever leave my child in a stranger's home for a single night, let alone weeks, months, or even, in Shannan's case, years on end. Especially being the beautiful young girl that Shannan was, there are just too many monsters out there to even take that risk. But anyway, that was Shannan's childhood. She was placed in a series of foster homes between the ages of 7 and 13, while her sisters were still at home together with their mother. And Shannan would still see her sisters around at school. So I want you to take a minute and really think about what it felt like being Shannan in this time in her life. She's a young girl in school, and there's normal things that we all deal with, right? Like bullies and mean girls and peer pressure and hormones and being rejected by your friends or your crush. And now add your mom to putting you in foster care while the rest of your family is still together under one roof. That's a level of rejection that I just cannot even fathom. Not to mention the rumors that must have spread through her school like wildfire. Kids can be incredibly cruel, and with how quickly gossip makes its rounds, I can just imagine these kids saying the most hurtful and cruel things to Shannan, because on the outside it just looks like her mom didn't want her. That's just me speculating. I don't know if that was truly Shannan's experience, but I would be more surprised if it wasn't. And even if that wasn't the case, even if, let's say, Shannan was not bullied at all, nobody at school knew, I think it goes without saying that Shannan felt heartbroken and abandoned, at least at some level. No matter what excuses she was given for this arrangement, I can't imagine that anybody could feel that they were loved or cared about. And my heart truly aches for Shannan and for any child who was quite frankly given up on. So at the age of 12, Shannan was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. So here's her childhood in a nutshell, right? She was placed in foster care, and then when she was at home, she would suffer from abuse. She was diagnosed with a bipolar disorder, and on top of that, she suffered from eating disorders. So it's clear that Shannan had her share of struggles. We can all agree there, right? But despite the obstacles placed in Shannan's way, that didn't stop her. Shannan was fierce, and those who knew her said that she was very intelligent and she had a lot of promise. In fact, at the age of 16, she graduated early from high school, to where she then enrolled into some nursing classes while she worked a number of odd jobs at different restaurants and hotels and as a secretary at a school. However, like many young girls, Shannan had big dreams, and her dreams couldn't be contained with this lifestyle. Shannan wanted more. She dreamed of being a singer and a songwriter. She wanted the Hollywood stardom. But in her mind, she thought, how am I ever going to get there by working as a secretary? And then a friend of hers told her about a group called the Lace Party Girls, which was an escort company. While Shannan was a little apprehensive at first, when she heard about how much money these girls would make in a single night, practically how much she would make in an entire month, Shannan saw this as an opportunity, almost like a shortcut to the life that she always wanted. So she decided to quit her job as a secretary and join the Lace Party Girls. Now, this company provided the girls with drivers that would make sure that the girls got to their clients and then back home safely. And this is when Shannan met a man by the name of Alex Diaz, who was a driver for the Lace Party Girls. And in an instant, the two of them felt a spark. And while they were friends for a short period of time, they began to date. The relationship was really good for a while, as the two were both working in the same industry, so they understood each other, and they were making some really good money where they were able to splurge on the party life. You know, the drinking and drugs and partying, all of the things that come with this lifestyle. But Shannan was also known to be very generous with her money, often buying her mom and her sisters lavish gifts and clothing and jewelry, and really just giving them money whenever they needed it. And while financially, Shannan was doing very well for herself, she hit a few snags along the way when she was nabbed as a part of a sting operation against the Lace Party Girls. Shannan was arrested and charged with solicitation as a prostitute. The sting operation would eventually shut down the Lace Party Girls, and soon Shannan's financial situation took a little bit of a dive and trouble started brewing. In 2010, Shannan started working independently, where she contacted one of the drivers from the Lace Party Girls, Michael Pack, or Mike, who was looking for a job. So Shannan hired Mike to drive for her, and in return, she would give him 25% of her earnings. She began advertising her services on websites like Backpage and Craigslist. But as Shannan's drug use became more frequent, much of her money started going to these extracurricular activities. She would even kind of include them in her package deal, and she would do these substances with her clients. And not long after, as these things normally do, Shannan's relationship with Alex went downhill as they began fighting on a regular basis. And one night, the fight would become physical. Shannan came home late after work, intoxicated, and the two started screaming and yelling at each other. Alex then punched Shannan with such force that he actually broke her jaw. The injury to Shannan was so extensive, she required surgery to insert a metal plate into her jawbone. Now, I don't know if that was the first time that Alex had ever hit Shannan. In an interview, he said that after that night, he felt so guilty that he never hit her again. But for physical abuse to reach the point of a broken jaw, my guess is that he had gotten physical with her before. But nevertheless, this wouldn't be the end of Alex and Shannan. When Shannan wasn't working, she was still trying to make her dreams of becoming a superstar a reality. She began taking courses in communication, and she would frequent singing auditions in Manhattan. But unfortunately, Shannan would never see her dreams come true. On April 30th, 2010, Shannan and Alex planned what seems to be a pretty fun date night. They went to a scary movie where they snuck in Taco Bell. The two seemed to have a great night together. And after the movie, Shannan's driver, Mike, picked her up for work. But little did anybody know that would be the last time Alex would see Shannan alive. At 2 a.m. on May 1st, 2010, so just hours after the movie, Mike brought Shannan to a first-time client. Initially, they were both apprehensive about going to this client because he was located in Long Island, and that's much further than the area that Shannan typically services. However, the client offered her quite a bit more than her normal rate, and as she was trying to save some money for a birthday gift for her mom, Shannan decided to take the job anyway. Now, Joe, the client, he was a 47-year-old newly divorced bachelor that was looking for a good time ever since his wife left. He lived in a 2,400 square foot beachfront house in an upscale gated community called Oak Beach. Neighbors claimed that since his divorce, his house became a party pad, so it wasn't unusual for him to have late night guests of this sort. So according to Mike, like any other job, he said he drove Shannan to Joe's house and sat outside in his SUV waiting for Shannan until she was done. He got a few calls from Shannan as she purportedly asked him to go to the local CVS to pick up some items for this client, such as lubrication, playing cards, and things like that. Now, this isn't too unusual. This usually happens. However, according to Mike, he said no because they weren't familiar with this area. He had never really been to the Long Island area, and he didn't feel comfortable driving around not really knowing where he is or where he's going. So Mike says no. Now, phone records show Shannan calling Mike a few times around 3 a.m., Mike returning a call, then Shannan calling Mike for the last time at 4:09 a.m., where Mike said he was taking a nap in his car. Shortly after this call, a tapping at his window would wake up Mike. It was Joe stating that he needed help getting Shannan out of his house because she became, as Joe described, inexplicably unhinged. Mike follows Joe back into the house where they find Shannan curled in a ball, sitting behind his couch and shaking intensely. At 4:51 a.m., Shannan called 911 and she spoke to a dispatcher for nearly 23 minutes. And spoke isn't really the right way to describe this call because much of it seemed like her phone was in her hand, she wasn't really talking, or maybe it was in her pocket. So you can hear a lot of what's going on in the background. And as a side note, this call wasn't released to the public until May 2022, 12 years after Shannan went missing. According to officials, they didn't want to release the call because it could get in the way of the investigation, which maybe a year I can understand, maybe even 2, but 12, especially considering that her death would eventually be considered unrelated to Lisk, It just seems very suspicious to me. And when you hear more about the police department during this period, you'll further understand why this decision was made. But anyway, during that 911 call, Shannan can be heard saying that she needs help because somebody was after her. And she repeats this over and over and over again.
State Police, Trooper Fry. State Police.
Yeah, there's somebody after me.
I'm sorry?
There's somebody after me.
Where are you?
There's somebody after me.
Okay, where are you?
When the dispatcher asks her for more information, like where she's located or who is after her, these questions go unanswered. You can hear two men in the background who are later identified as Joseph Brewer and Michael Pack. As both men are trying to get Shannan out of the house, you can hear Shannan ask Mike, quote, "Are you going to kill me?" To which he responds, quote, "Are you crazy? You're freaking me out." Mike tells Shannan, let's go back to Manhattan, all right?
I think it's Suffolk County on the Suffolk County Manhattan.
Why are you
Call Suffolk County.
You freaking me out, come on.
I'm in the middle of nowhere?
Let's go back to Manhattan, right? We're in Long Island, we're out near the water.
She finally leaves Joe's house. Now later in Joseph Brewer's statement to the police, he said that after Shannan left the house, he went upstairs and went to sleep and had nothing to do with Shannan after that point. During the 911 call, the dispatcher is continuously trying to get answers out of Shannan, but most are unsuccessful. You can hear Mike in the background, and he's almost joking with Shannan, almost like one would with a drunk friend. When Shannan mentions that Mike wants to kill her, it's not like he's taking it serious. It doesn't even sound like he's being aggressive with her or anything like that. In my opinion, I don't think he really knew the extent of what was going on in her head. But then Shannan starts telling Mike that he's in on it, almost as if she believed he had set her up to be killed. At least that's what I've gathered from it. So at this point, Mike and Shannan are still outside in the front of Joe's house. But instead of Shannan getting into Mike's SUV, she starts running frantically around the neighborhood, screaming at the top of her lungs and knocking on the door of any house with a light on. First, she runs to the house of a neighbor, Gus Coletti. While Shannan is still on the phone with the dispatcher, you can hear Coletti in the background asking Shannan if she's okay, to which she responds, "I need help." So Coletti welcomed her into his house. Shortly thereafter, you can hear Shannan yelling and repeating that somebody is after her and trying to kill her. So Coletti called the police at 5:22 a.m. and explained the situation. She flees Coletti's home, then runs to hide under his boat just on the side of his house.
What's the matter? Somebody after you? Huh?
Hello? Hello?
Don't get yourself hurt. Where are you going? Wait a minute. Where are you going? Where are you going?
Then Shannan ran to another neighbor, Barbara Brennan. While Barbara heard Shannan pounding on her door, she called 911 herself, telling the dispatcher that a woman was outside saying that she was in danger. But since Barbara didn't know who this woman was or who was after her, she didn't feel safe opening the door. At this point, Mike is driving behind Shannan, trying to get her back in the car. After 22 minutes and 40 seconds, Shannan's phone disconnects from the 911 call. So did she do too many drugs? Was she hallucinating, thinking that Mike was going to kill her or that he was in on it? Or was she genuinely afraid of him? Or was she having some sort of mental breakdown? To this day, many of these questions are still unanswered. Meanwhile, Coletti told police that he witnessed a man and a 14-year-old girl who was actually 22-year-old Shannan Gilbert. But that's how small and petite she was. Gus actually thought she was 14 years old. But he said he saw them near the gate of the entranceway of the Oak Beach community. When police arrived 45 minutes later, neither Shannan nor Mike were there. So police were unable to respond to Shannan's call because they never got her exact location. So at this point, keep in mind that police haven't connected the calls between Gus Coletti, Barbara Brennan, and Shannan Gilbert. They have no idea that this is the same event taking place. As far as they know, a woman named Shannan Gilbert, they know her name, is saying that someone is after her and that she's in Long Island, but they don't know exactly where. They don't know that she's in Oak Beach. And then they know that she is with somebody named Mike, but they don't know his last name. They don't know who she's running away from, and they don't really know too much of anything else at this point. But long story short, police didn't connect these calls until months later. When the police arrived to Oak Beach to respond to Coletti's and Brennan's call and found nobody there, they basically figured that there was no active emergency. Everything was good, so they left. Later that morning, Shannan's boyfriend Alex woke up to an empty bed, which was very unlike Shannan. Sure, she would get home late, which comes with the territory, but she would always come home. So immediately, Alex knew that something was wrong. So he called Mike and asked if he knew where Shannan was, and Mike broke down the whole story. And he told him that he brought Shannan to a client's house in Oak Beach, where she started going crazy after a few hours. And as he kept trying to get her in his SUV, she ran off in a drug-fueled craze, and he got tired of chasing her, so he left. Mike claims that Shannan ran off into the marsh, and he decided to leave, believing that she would somehow make it home safely. As we know, she never did. So Alex and Mike both went back to the Oak Beach community in attempts to talk to Joe or any other residents who might have seen something and trace Shannan's footsteps. But unfortunately, they were unsuccessful in finding any trace of Shannan. Alex called Shannan's mother, Mary, and asked if they had seen her, to which Mary and her sisters said that they were also trying to contact Shannan, but were only able to reach her voicemail. So at this point, they're all starting to get very worried about Shannan, and Alex decides to go down to the Suffolk County Police Department to file a missing persons report. Now, according to Alex, he said that the SCPD just brushed off the whole situation. They didn't really seem to take it seriously and basically just told him, just go ahead and go home. That's probably where Shannan is. So Alex did as he was told, and he went back home. But when he got there, he found his house just the way he left it, and there were no signs of Shannan. Now, this is where things get even more strange. On May 3rd, just 2 days after Shannan's disappearance, Shannan's mother, Mary, received a call from a strange man. According to Mary, this man said, quote, "I'm calling to see if your daughter Shannan is there." And after Mary replied no and asked the man who he was, he identified himself as Dr. Peter Hackett. And he explained that he ran a house for wayward girls and that Shannan was with him just a few nights ago, where he medicated her to help calm her down. According to this male caller, Shannan left with a male driver and he was worried about her. But a few things instantly struck Mary as odd. First thing, nobody had really known that Shannan had been missing because the police didn't put out a missing persons report. And second, how in the world did this strange man get her phone number? Did Shannan give it to him? Or maybe he took it off of her cell phone? She just knew that something wasn't right. Now, despite Mary's past with Shannan, I still wholeheartedly believe that Mary loved her daughter. And it seemed that after all the time had passed, they got past their rocky history. But Mary acted like any concerned mother would. She went down to the police department to file a missing persons report. She told the officers that Shannan had met up with a client in Oak Beach, and that was the last time that she was seen. Now, similarly to Alex's experience, Mary felt like the police officers weren't really too concerned with Shannan's disappearance. I also heard in an interview that they told her that because of Shannan's occupation, they wouldn't file a missing persons report for 10 days, which just seems ridiculous to me, knowing how dangerous this job can be, right? So just having them wait for 10 days when we know that those first 24, 48, even 72 hours are the most crucial. So Mary and her family decided to take things into their own hands. They drove down to the Oak Beach community, asking all of the residents if they had seen anything. They posted flyers with Shannan's face on every telephone pole, every bulletin board, and they looked for clues or any evidence as to where Shannan can be or what happened to her. But just like Mike and Alex, their efforts were to no avail. So where was Shannan Gilbert, and what happened to her? Did her client do something, or her driver Mike? Or maybe something happened with that guy, Dr. Peter Hackett? Unfortunately, it took months for police to connect the missing persons report to the Oak Beach 911 calls. And finally, they realized that the 23-minute phone call was the missing person, Shannan Gilbert. And here, I don't even understand how they weren't able to connect the two, because we have the missing persons report as Shannan Gilbert, and during her phone call, she said her name was Shannan Gilbert. So how they never connected these, I'm not sure. But even with this major discovery, police still didn't seem eager to find Shannan. Officers did question a few people of interest, but nothing came about it. Detectives started with Michael Pack, but according to his statement, he said that he believed Shannan was just trying to play a trick on him and kind of weasel her way out of paying his share of that night's profits. So when she ran off into the marsh, he was done trying to get her to come back to his SUV, so he just decided to leave. And when Mike passed a polygraph test, officers cleared him of any suspicion. Then they spoke to the client, Joseph Brewer. Joe told the story of that night, admitting that he had contact with her and the two of them did a bunch of drugs together, and then she left in a drug-induced panic. But he claimed he didn't have sex with Shannan because she, quote, looked like a man. Now, I have some questions about this, like, why would Shannan have asked Mike to go pick up some lubrication if the two of them weren't having sex? Furthermore, he's expecting people to believe that he didn't have sex with Shannan, who is a sex worker, while he's paying for her to be there. And she was in his house for nearly 3 hours, but they didn't have sex. Come on. And then saying that she looked like a man, but he was the one willing to pay her even more than her normal rate, while he booked her off of either Craigslist or Backpage, so he saw her. I'm not saying that he had anything to do with her death or her disappearance, but it's still bullshit in my opinion. But according to reports, Joe also passed a polygraph test, and he was also cleared by the SCPD. Then they spoke to a few of the Oak Beach residents, including Gus Coletti, Barbara Brennan, and a Dr. Peter Hackett. The man Mary said she got a call from just a few days after Shannan had been missing. Upon his interview, he said that he had never seen Shannan, and later he utterly refuted the claim that he had ever called Mary, suggesting that she made it all up. As this took place in a gated community, there were a few security cameras in place, one being at the entrance of the community where Coletti claimed he last saw Shannan. However, while the footage was in the care of Dr. Peter Hackett, who was the officer of the Association Board of Oak Beach, the camera footage at the entranceway was erased, leaving no evidence for police. Dr. Hackett was cleared of any involvement, as police suggested that he merely had a history of exaggerating and sticking his nose in where it didn't belong. Now, clearing all of these men so easily really raises some red flags for me. As we know, polygraph tests are not even admissible in court, but you're clearing suspects just because they passed one? That just seems so sloppy to me. And then clearing Dr. Peter Hackett so easily because he has a history of exaggerating is even worse. So the investigation was halted. And many believe because of Shannan's line of work, police didn't really value her life, thus they didn't really take this search very seriously. And I'm not going to sit here and try to deny that because let's face it, there's certainly some truth to that. But there's even more to this botched investigation, and you'll hear about that later. So weeks went on and nothing, then months. But in December of 2010, the investigation took a turn that nobody would have expected. Suffolk County police officer Malia and his canine Blue were conducting some training exercises on Gilgo Beach, just 8 miles from Oak Beach, where Shannan was last seen. And here in the marshy lands of Gilgo Beach, the canine Blue found a set of remains. Now, initially, they even released a press conference stating they believed these remains were Shannan Gilbert. However, later, the autopsy found that the DNA was not a match. While searching the area for more evidence, SCPD made more gruesome discoveries. Over the next 6 months, they uncovered 9 more sets of remains, all in the Gilgo Beach area, most of who were identified as young women in their early to mid-20s with petite builds and who worked as sex workers, very much matching the same description as Shannan Gilbert. However, Shannan had a distinguishable attribute that they didn't find in any of these victims. They were looking for the metal plate in her jawbone, and while none of these remains had that in their jaw, they knew that these victims were not Shannan. While the search for Shannan continued, it was clear there was a serial killer at work. Now, as much as I want to dive into who these victims are and the circumstances around their deaths, I'm saving that for another video, so be on the lookout for that one. Make sure you're subscribed, hit the notification bell so you don't miss it. But anyway, they dubbed this killer as the Long Island serial killer, aka Lisk. After this horrific discovery, the SCPD had immense pressure from the public and the victims' families, so they took this investigation up a notch, just like a little bit though. Cops went back and raided Joseph Brewer's home, bringing in a police dog and towing his white SUV to search it for evidence. But apparently their search came up short as they found nothing. They didn't find anything connecting him to the deaths of any of the victims or to the disappearance of Shannan Gilbert. With more resources and manpower, the SCPD finally decided to thoroughly search the Oak Beach area. About freaking time, right? In December of 2011, investigators would find several of Shannan's belongings, including her purse, her wallet, shoes, and her cell phone. And a week later, 19 months after she had been reported missing, they found her body. Shannan Gilbert was found dead, just 30 yards away from the Oak Beach resident, Dr. Peter Hackett. When her body was discovered in the marshy area of Oak Beach, her death was ruled undetermined, while her autopsy was inconclusive, both on cause and manner of death. Though at the time, police theorized that it was dark out, and while running in the marsh in a drug-induced state, Shannan had gotten lost in the 6-foot weeds and perhaps drowned, suggesting her death was an accident and completely unrelated to the Long Island serial killer, essentially ruling out homicide entirely. Now, to be fair, during the filming of The Killing Season, it was a show dedicated to the investigation of the Gilgo murders, the director, Josh Zeman, stated that he went to the location where Shannan was found. And to his surprise, he also found the marsh to be very thick and hard to get through. So was her death just a drug-induced accident or maybe related to a mental disorder? And to add to this theory, because it is important to look at all of the facts, mental illness certainly ran in Shannan's genetics. In 2016, Shannan's mother, Mary, was found stabbed to death, and her murderer was Shannan's younger sister, Sarah. According to court documents, Sarah suffered from schizophrenia, and she was hospitalized on multiple occasions to help her work through this. In a schizophrenic episode, Sarah began to hear voices telling her that her mother was the devil and a bad god. These voices directed Sarah to kill Mary. So she proceeded to call her mother and told Mary to come on over, to which Mary did. And when she arrived, she was unexpectedly ambushed by Sarah, who stabbed her 227 times with a 15-inch kitchen blade, bludgeoned her with a fire extinguisher, and then sprayed the fire extinguisher foam into her mouth. And once her mom was dead, Sarah stripped her naked and removed all of her jewelry. All of this happened just months after Mary obtained custody of Sarah's son, after Sarah allegedly drowned their puppy in front of him. Now, this is a whole case on its own, but Sarah was clearly suffering from some mental illnesses. She was convicted and sentenced to 25 years in a state prison. But with this in mind, maybe Shannan really did have a mental breakdown of some sort. The case for mental illness isn't entirely weak. But Shannan Gilbert's family and their criminal defense attorney, John Ray, have been vocal about believing this investigation was done poorly, and they explicitly disagree with this conclusion. Upon investigating Shannan's death on their own, John Ray hired renowned medical examiner Dr. Michael Baden, a former chief medical examiner and former chief forensic pathologist, to re-examine Shannan's body. So Dr. Baden isn't some pseudoscientist. He was the very best at what he did until he retired. And what he found in Shannan's autopsy was very interesting. According to Dr. Baden's report, quote, almost all of the skeletal bones were recovered and appeared normal. There was no evidence of trauma. However, the larynx was missing and only the body of the hyoid bone was found. The two greater horns of that neck bone were missing. These structures, the larynx and the hyoid bone, are often fractured during homicidal manual strangulation. End quote. And later in the report, he discussed her toxicology results, stating that no abuse of drugs, including cocaine, were found, and finally concluding, quote, it is in my opinion, based on the circumstances of Shannan's death and on the materials that I have reviewed, that there is no evidence that she died of a natural disease, of a drug overdose, or of drowning. There is insufficient information to determine a definite cause of death, but the autopsy findings are consistent with homicidal strangulation, end quote. So this autopsy report doesn't really fit the theories that police suggested. Furthermore, Shannan Gilbert was found face up, while typically you would expect a drowning victim to be face down. Here's a photo of where Shannan's body was found. Of course, the water level may rise a little here and there, but during that time of year, the water is still fairly shallow, making it even more unlikely that she drowned on her back. In addition, the police theory suggested that Shannan got lost in the weeds because it was dark outside, right? However, when Coletti made the call to police, it was 5:22 a.m., just as the sun began to rise. Now, unless Shannan had gotten lost within just an hour of seeing Coletti, I just don't understand how that can even be theorized, that it was too dark outside. Of course, it's not mid-daylight, but the sun is rising and it rises fairly quickly. So to me, that theory doesn't really make sense. Something else happened or somebody else was responsible. And I want to go back to Joseph Brewer's statement. He said that night he and Shannan did a lot of drugs, but the autopsy done by Dr. Baden showed that she had no drug use in her system, which leads me to question if she actually died the night that she went missing. Now, unless I'm missing something, it seems like she must have been alive at least long enough for those drugs to pass through her system, right? Is there something that I'm missing here? Perhaps she was in this marshy area for a few days before she died, But it's also possible that somebody might have stumbled upon her and maybe did something to her, especially considering the damage done to her hyoid bone in her neck. That bone is very hard to fracture, accounting for only 0.02% of human bone fractures. So what else could explain that injury? Shannan's body was found 30 yards away from Dr. Peter Hackett, the same man who was responsible for deleting the camera footage. Also, the man that Shannan's mom, Mary, claimed to have received a call from just 2 days after Shannan went missing. And like I said earlier, Dr. Peter Hackett utterly refuted this claim, stating that he never made that call to begin with. But later, he would switch his story and said that he did call, but he was calling for his friends as they were searching for Shannan. When phone records revealed the truth and proved that he indeed called Mary on May 3rd, just 2 days after Shannan went missing, he said that he couldn't remember his story, and a person gets a lot of phone calls insinuating he couldn't keep track. Given that this man changed his story a number of times, lied about calling Mary, said he was helping his friends with the search, and then yet deleted the surveillance footage, and then Shannan was found near his home, it just seems awfully suspicious to me, and at the very least deserving of a full interrogation. Now, to his credit, the police didn't come asking for this footage until months after Shannan's disappearance. So it could be possible that the footage deletes frequently. However, we know that he knew about Shannan's death because the phone records proved that he called just 2 days after she was seen. So why would he have deleted that footage? Any rational person, especially someone with the intellect and the background of a doctor, they would be smart enough to keep that footage unless they have something to hide. While suspicion continues to run around those involved with Shannan that night and around Dr. Peter Hackett, they were all cleared by the SCPD. So it's pretty evident that this entire investigation was grossly mishandled from the very beginning. Whether it was botched intentionally or just out of utter incompetence can be debated. But hopefully one day we'll find out the truth. Now, with the death of Shannan Gilbert and the Gilgo Beach victims, much of these investigations coincided. And while Shannan's death was eventually considered unrelated to Lisk, the investigation into the serial killings wasn't handled any better. Of course, in many cases, there's not enough evidence to connect a suspect and leads run dry. These things do happen. But that wasn't the case in this investigation. This case did not lack evidence, but instead had a lack of priority in a whirlwind of power dynamics and scandal. An article in the Long Island Press claimed that the corruption in the Suffolk County Police Department put the investigation on the back burner. And in my opinion, they took that baby off the stove altogether. The SCPD went through an upheaval leading to some daytime TV-like drama. Like, this gets wild. It seriously sounds like, when I'm listening to it, it sounds like it's an episode from Law and Order. In 2011, shortly after the bodies were found on Gilgo Beach and the investigation began, Chief Investigator James Burke was promoted to the police chief of SCPD, officially taking over the investigation. Now, something I want you to keep in mind as we go through James Burke's history, according to some reports, as Dr. Peter Hackett was the head of the Suffolk County Emergency Services and the police surgeon, he and James Burke were fairly familiar with one another. Now, I haven't been able to verify the claims of their friendship, but that certainly seems like a possibility. And as mystery still revolves around these cases, I think it's something to consider. But to understand the mindset of James Burke, or Jimmy as most called him, we have to go back a little bit, because this man was the center of many scandals throughout his long career as a police officer. Colleagues described Jimmy as a sex-obsessed narcissist and a middle-aged bachelor with a vulgar disregard for social niceties. Some of his scandals include drug problems, DWIs, and attending drug-fueled sex parties with sex workers. where once he allegedly grabbed a girl by her hair, dragged her outside, and pulled her to the ground. Insiders also claimed that Jimmy would ask the other officers to surveil his girlfriend and his ex-girlfriends. Now, if that's not a red flag, I don't know what is. In 1993, he was busted for leaving his firearm unsecured while he was having sex with a sex worker in his patrol car. So this Jimmy Burke clearly has an extensive history with sex workers, and allegedly these encounters were not always friendly, and his attitude towards his colleagues wasn't any better. Jimmy apparently held grudges against his colleagues and his subordinates, allegedly punishing them with threats and demotions. Normally, these types of scandals would lead to termination, or at least they should. This man clearly shouldn't be a police officer, let alone the police chief. However, Jimmy had connections to then federal prosecutor Tom Spada, and their kinship dates back to the 1970s, where as a teenager, Jimmy was the star witness in a murder trial, and his testimony helped win Spada's case. Spada, who is believed to have helped Jimmy cover up his tracks, hired James Burke as an investigator at his firm in the 90s, then promoted Jimmy to chief investigator, and finally vouched for Jimmy Burke when the county executive Stephen Bellone appointed him as the chief of the police department in 2011. At the same time, the bodies of these sex workers were being discovered. As Chief Burke took control of the Gilgo Beach investigation, one of his first moves was to threaten Chief of Detectives Dominic Verone by forcing him to either retire within 15 days or be demoted. Now, considering that Chief Verone was spearheading this investigation and had thorough knowledge of the details in this case, this was already raising some red flags. Verone was also prohibited from sharing any details of the case with the new investigators. And it gets worse. Following this decision, Chief Burke severed the department's ties with the FBI, basically telling them to go F themselves and their help wasn't needed. While there's no evidence as to what was behind Burke's motivations to burn bridges with the FBI or fire Chief Verone, it certainly raises suspicion. Under normal circumstances, when a string of serial murders is being investigated, the local police departments can use all of the help that they can get. So why is Burke refusing help entirely? It doesn't make any logical sense unless there's something that we don't know. So everything about Jimmy Burke just rubs me the wrong way. This man is clearly bad news, and the scandal doesn't end there. In 2012, so just a year after he was promoted to police chief, Jimmy Burke assaulted a man by the name of Christopher Loeb, or Chris. Now, apparently, one night, Chris had stolen a Navy duffel bag from the back of Burke's unlocked department-issued SUV. Chris was subsequently tracked down and taken into custody, where he was physically assaulted by Chief Jimmy Burke. According to Chris, he claims that Jimmy beat him while he was still in handcuffs and did so because what Chris found in that duffel bag was incriminating. He claims that he opened the Navy duffel bag and found Chief Burke's gun belt, ammunition, a box of cigars, and a bag containing sex toys, Viagra, handcuffs, a whistle, and several homemade porno DVDs. He goes on to say that he played one of the discs. Now, before I say what Chris claims was on that DVD, let me be clear. This part of the story is alleged. There has been no evidence released to verify whether the claims of these DVDs are true. But also keep in mind that Chris, at this point, doesn't know about Chief Jimmy Burke and his history with sex workers. So I find his claims rather compelling. But Chris claims as he played the DVD, he saw a guy with a mask on torturing a woman believed to be a sex worker. I won't go into detail about what else allegedly happened in that video, but it seemed clear to Chris that it was not consensual as the woman in the video looked terrified. This video was essentially a snuff film. leading me to question what Chief Jimmy Burke was doing with it in his vehicle, assuming, of course, that these claims are legitimate. Because if they are false, physically assaulting a man over items that Jimmy described as embarrassing just seems a bit of an overkill to me. Because remember, everything else has been verified as true. Just the DVDs are in question. When assault charges were pressed against Chief Burke, he conspired with then District Attorney Tom Spada. Remember Tom Spada, the federal prosecutor that allegedly covered Jimmy's tracks and he helped him get promoted? Yeah, that same guy. He's now the district attorney. And get this, the two of them, so the district attorney, Spada, and Jimmy Burke, also conspired with the Anti-Corruption Bureau chief, Christopher McPartland. Yes, you heard that right. The Anti-Corruption Bureau chief. So both Spada and McPartland attempted to cover up the assault for Jimmy Burke by tampering with witnesses. Thankfully, a few years went by and they were eventually caught conspiring, and both Spada and McPartland went to trial, losing their positions. So now the former DA, Tom Spada, was convicted of witness tampering, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison and ordered to pay $100,000 in fines. The former Anti-Corruption Bureau chief McPartland was also sentenced to 5 years in prison. And just as a side note, 5 years? Are you freaking kidding me? These prisons that these types of criminals go to are an absolute joke. This whole sentence is just laughable to me. Even the U.S. District Judge Joan Azraq said, quote, "This was not a momentary moral lapse, but years of criminal cover-up," end quote. These men were doing the opposite of what their jobs were to do, and they created a culture of corruption in Suffolk County at the same time a serial killer investigation was taking place. Now, I'm really curious as to what else was covered up that never came to light, because I cannot imagine in any circumstance that this was the only time they ever covered for James Burke. This was just the only time that they got caught. But anyway, now they don't have anybody covering up the assault, so the case against Jimmy Burke went to trial in 2016, where now former Chief Burke pled guilty to a civil rights violation for the assault of Christopher Loeb. Jimmy was released in 2019 after serving nearly 4 years behind bars. So let's recap really quickly. Jimmy Burke, he had a history of sexual encounters with sex workers, some allegedly aggressive, a severe drug problem. He had connections with the DA and the Anti-Corruption Bureau, where they were helping Burke cover up his crimes, and Burke assaulted a man for stealing, as he calls it, embarrassing items. And then, if we want to just sprinkle in the theories out there of the possession of the snuff films and his possible connections with Dr. Peter Hackett. Now again, I don't know the extent of the truth of those claims, but understanding Jimmy Burke and the connections that he had, it certainly wouldn't surprise me. Now, with all of this information out there, there's certainly some questions to be had. Like, is it ethical or slightly rational to have a man with such a history with sex workers to be leading the investigation of several murdered sex workers? This man shouldn't be in law enforcement, let alone involved in a case like this. So he bullied the chief of detectives into retiring, barred the FBI from helping with the Gilgo murder investigation. So why did Jimmy drop the ball so badly when it came to this investigation? Some believe Jimmy Burke was actually involved in the Gilgo Beach murders, or at the very least involved in the murder of Shannan Gilbert, thus did everything he could to derail the investigation. Could he have had something to do with making sure that the camera footage was deleted? I won't say it's impossible. It is possible, though, that someone was able to use information against Chief Burke to keep him quiet, because he certainly gave them enough ammunition. Though others believe that while he wasn't involved in the murders, he just severed ties with the FBI to avoid any detection of his own illicit behaviors. Nevertheless, it's devious and it certainly deserves a deeper investigation. Due to this undisputedly botched investigation, it's very likely that more victims would be made at the hands of the Long Island serial killer. Thankfully, the Suffolk County Police Department cleaned house and they were eager to bring integrity back into the legal system, and their first mission was to put the Lisk investigation to the forefront. And now, as we know, as of July 2023, a suspect, Rex Heuermann, has been arrested. And hopefully they'll reinvestigate Shannan Gilbert's death as well, because there's still a lot of sloppiness overshadowing her death, and Shannan and her family deserve closure, and they deserve to know that Shannan's life mattered. It mattered enough to deserve a thorough investigation. And even if they come to the same conclusion and they say that her death had nothing to do with Lisk and it was not a murder, at least they knew that it was being taken seriously. But I'm dying to know what you think. What do you think about Jimmy Burke and the extent of his involvement or his possible connection with Dr. Peter Hackett? It seems to me that Burke's high position on the police force and Dr. Peter Hackett, a police surgeon, their paths probably crossed at some point. Maybe they did some favors for one another. I don't know. Or do you think Dr. Peter Hackett is responsible? Do you think that Jimmy was just a corrupt officer, or do you think that he was more involved with the murders? It certainly seems that he had connections to cover his tracks, or at the very least, he lacked the integrity and he would certainly help someone else cover theirs. Or do you think neither one of them are involved? Do you think that Shannan Gilbert, that her death was truly an accident, perhaps the result of a manic episode? I honestly go back and forth. I think it's a tough call when you really look at all of the evidence and her family's history of mental illness. But whatever the case may be, after so much tragedy and devastation has hit this family, I hope they can all find peace soon. But I can't wait to hear your thoughts and theories, so make sure you leave them in the comment section down below. Other than that, that is all I have for this case for now. If there's any updates, I'll be sure to be posting those. So make sure that you are subscribed, hit the like button if you like this video, and I will see you on the next one. Bye!